Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram at snoozecast to find behind-the-scenes content. If Snoozecast helps you fall asleep easier, please consider helping others find out about us by writing a review on the Apple Podcasts app, or by sharing your favorite episode on social media, or, of course, by sharing us with a friend. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters and by Budding Valleys. Tonight, we'll read the next part to The Princess and the Goblin, a children's fantasy novel published in 1872. If you'd like an easy way to listen to these continuing episodes in order, go to snoozecast.com/series. When we left off, Princess Irene was in conversation with her grandmother, preparing to leave for the evening. Her grandmother gives Irene the gift of a magical ring that provides a thread for her to find her way back to safety if she is ever in danger. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Irene gazed at the grand lady before her and said, "Please, I want to ask you one more question. Is it because you have your crown on you that you look so young? Since the other times the princess had met her, she looked very different." "No, child," answered her grandmother. "It is because I felt so young this evening that I put my crown on, and I thought you would like to see your old grandmother in her best." "Why do you call yourself old? You're not old, grandmother." "I am very old indeed. It is so silly of people. I don't mean you, for you are such a tiny thing and couldn't know better. But it is so silly of people to fancy that old age means crookedness and witheredness and feebleness and sticks and spectacles and rheumatism and forgetfulness. It's so silly. Old age has nothing whatever to do with all that. The right old age means strength and beauty and mirth and courage and clear eyes and strong limbs. I am older than you are able to think, and look at you, grandmother," cried Irene, jumping up and flinging her arms around her neck. "I won't be so silly again, I promise you. At least, I'm rather afraid to promise, but if I am, I promise to be sorry for it. I do. I wish I were as old as you, grandmother. I don't think you're ever afraid of anything." "Not for long, at least, my child. Perhaps by the time I am 2,000 years of age, I shall, indeed, never be afraid of anything. But I confess I have sometimes been afraid about my children, sometimes about you, Irene." "Oh, I'm so sorry, grandmother. Tonight, I suppose you mean?" "Yes, a little tonight, but a good deal when you had all but made up your mind that I was a dream and no real great-great-grandmother. You must not suppose I am blaming you for that. I dare say you could not help it. I don't know, grandmother, said the princess, beginning to cry. I can't always do myself as I should like, and I don't always try. I'm very sorry anyhow. The lady stooped, lifted her in her arms, and sat down with her in her chair, holding her close to her bosom. In a few minutes, the princess had sobbed herself to sleep. How long she slept, I do not know. When she came to herself, she was sitting in her own high chair at the nursery table with her doll's house before her. Chapter 16. The Ring. The same moment her nurse came into the room, sobbing. When she saw her sitting there, she started back with a loud cry of amazement and joy. Then, running to her, she caught her in her arms and covered her with kisses. My precious, darling princess, where have you been? What has happened to you? We've all been crying our eyes out and searching the house from top to bottom for you. Not quite from the top, thought Irene to herself, and she might have added, not quite to the bottom, perhaps, if she had known all. But the one she would not, and the other she could not say. Oh, Ludi, I've had such a dreadful adventure, she replied, and told her all about the cat with the long legs, and how she ran out upon the mountain and came back again. But she said nothing of her grandmother or her lamp. And there we've been searching for you all over the house for more than an hour and a half, exclaimed the nurse. But that's no matter, now we've got you. Only, princess, I must say, she added, her mood changing, what you ought to have done was to call for your own Ludi to come and help you, instead of running out of the house and up the mountain in that wild and, I must say, foolish fashion. Well, Ludi, said Irene, quietly, perhaps if you had a big cat, all legs, running at you, you might not exactly know what was the wisest thing to do at the moment. I wouldn't run up the mountain anyhow, returned Ludi. Not if you had time to think about it. But when those creatures came at you that night on the mountain, you were so frightened yourself that you lost your way home. This put a stop to Ludi's reproaches. She had been on the point of saying that the long-legged cat must have been a twilight fancy of the princess's, but the memory of that night and of the talking to which the king had given her in consequence prevented her from saying what, after all, she did not half believe. Having a strong suspicion that the cat was a goblin, for she knew nothing of the difference between the goblins and their creatures. She counted them all just goblins. Without another word, she went and got some fresh tea and bread and butter for the princess. Before she returned, the whole household, headed by the housekeeper, burst into the nursery to exult over their darling. The gentlemen at arms followed and were ready enough to believe all she told them about the long-legged cat. Indeed, though wise enough to say nothing about it, they remembered just such a creature amongst those they had surprised upon the princess's lawn. In their own hearts, they blamed themselves for not having kept better watch, and their captain gave orders that from this night the front door and all the windows on the ground floor should be locked immediately the sun set, and opened after upon no pretense whatever. The men-at-arms redoubled their vigilance, and for some time there was no further cause of alarm. When the princess woke the next morning, her nurse was bending over her. "How your ring does glow this morning, princess, just like a fiery rose," she said. "Does it, Ludi?" returned Irene. "Who gave me the ring, Ludi? I know I've had it a long time, but where did I get it? I don't remember." "I think it must have been your mother gave it to you, princess, but really, for as long as you have worn it, I don't remember that I ever heard," answered her nurse. "I will ask my king papa the next time he comes," said Irene. Chapter 17. Springtime. The spring, so dear to all creatures, young and old, came at last, and before the first few days of it had gone, the king rode through its budding valleys to see his little girl. He had been in a distant part of his dominions all the winter, for he was not in the habit of stopping in one great city, or of visiting only his favorite country houses, but he moved from place to place, that all his people might know him. Wherever he journeyed, he kept a constant lookout for the ablest and best men to put into office. And wherever he found himself mistaken, and those he had appointed incapable or unjust, he removed them at once. Hence you see, it was his care of the people that kept him from seeing his princess so often as he would have liked. You may wonder why he did not take her about with him, but there were several reasons against doing so, and I suspect her great-great-grandmother had had a principal hand in preventing it. Once more, Irene heard the bugle blast, and once more she was at the gate to meet her father as he rode up on his great white horse. After they had been alone for a little while, she thought of what she had resolved to ask him. "Please, King Papa," she said, "will you tell me where I got this pretty ring? I can't remember. The king looked at it. A strange, beautiful smile spread like sunshine over his face, and an answering smile, but at the same time a questioning one spread like moonlight over Irene's. "It was your queen mamma's once," he said. "And why isn't it hers now?" asked Irene. "She does not want it now," said the king, looking grave. "Why doesn't she want it now?" "Because she's gone where all those rings are made." "And when shall I see her?" asked the princess. "Not for some time yet," answered the king, and the tears came into his eyes. Irene did not remember her mother and did not know why her father looked so and why the tears came in his eyes, but she put her arms round his neck and kissed him and asked no more questions. The king was much disturbed on hearing the report of the gentlemen at arms concerning the creatures they had seen, and I presume would have taken Irene with him that very day, but for what the presence of the ring on her finger assured him of. About an hour before he left, Irene saw him go up the old stair, and he did not come down again till they were just ready to start. And she thought with herself that he had been up to see the old lady. When he went away, he left other 6 gentlemen behind him, that there might be 6 of them, always on guard. And now, in the lovely spring weather, Irene was out on the mountain the greater part of the day. In the warmer hollows there were lovely primroses, and not so many that she ever got tired of them. As often as she saw a new one opening an eye of light in the blind earth, she would clap her hands with gladness, and unlike some children I know, instead of pulling it, would touch it as tenderly as if it had been a new baby, and, having made its acquaintance, would leave it as happy as she found it. She treated the plants on which they grew like birds' nests. Every fresh flower was like a new little bird to her. She would pay visits to all the flower nests she knew, remembering each by itself. She would go down on her hands and knees beside one and say, "Good morning. Are you all smelling very sweet this morning? Goodbye." And then she would go to another nest and say the same. It was a favorite amusement with her. There were many flowers up and down, and she loved them all, but the primroses were her favorites. "They're not too shy, and they're not a bit forward," she would say to Ludi. There were goats, too, about over the mountain, and when the little kids came, she was as pleased with them as with the flowers. The goats belonged to the miners mostly, a few of them to Curdie's mother, but there were a good many wild ones that seemed to belong to nobody. These the goblins counted theirs, and it was upon them partly that they lived. The goblins also had a kind of sheep of their own, very strange creatures, which they drove out to feed at night. And the other goblin creatures were wise enough to keep good watch over them, for they knew the goblins took good care of them too. Chapter 18. Curdie's Clue. Curdie was as watchful as ever, but was almost getting tired of his ill success. Every other night or so, he followed the goblins out as they went on digging and boring, and getting as near them as he could, watched them from behind stones and rocks. But as yet, he seemed no nearer finding out what they had in view, as at first he always kept hold of the end of his string, while his pickaxe, left just outside the hole by which he entered the goblin's country from the mine, continued to serve as an anchor and hold fast the other end. The goblins, hearing no more noise in that quarter, had ceased to apprehend an immediate invasion and kept no watch. One night, after dodging about and listening till he was nearly falling asleep with weariness, he began to roll up his ball, for he had resolved to go home to bed. It was not long, however, before he began to feel bewildered. One after another, he passed goblin houses, caves that is, occupied by goblin families, and at length was sure they were many more than he had passed as he came. He had to use great caution to pass unseen. They lay so close together. Could his string have led him wrong? He still followed, winding it, and still it led him into more thickly populated quarters, until he became quite apprehensive. For although he was not afraid of the cobs, he was afraid of not finding his way out. But what could he do? It was of no use to sit down and wait for the morning. The morning made no difference here. It was dark, and always dark. He might even arrive within a yard of the mine and never know it. Seeing he could do nothing better, he would at least find where the end of his string was, and, if possible, how it had come to play him such a trick. He knew by the size of the ball that he was getting pretty near the last of it, when he began to feel a tugging and pulling at it. What could it mean? Turning a sharp corner, he thought he heard strange sounds. These grew as he went on to a scuffling and growling and squeaking, and the noise increased until, turning a second sharp corner, he found himself in the midst of it, and the same moment tumbled over a wallowing mass, which he knew must be a knot of the cob's creatures. Before he could recover his feet, he had caught some scratches on his face. But as he scrambled to get up, his hand fell upon his pickaxe. But before he could do any harm, he was laying about with it right and left in the dark. He stood for a little, weighing his battle axe in his hand, as if it was the most precious lump of metal. But indeed, no lump of gold itself could have been so precious at that time as the common tool. Then he untied the end of the string from it, put the ball in his pocket, and stood still thinking. It was clear that the cob's creatures had found his axe, had between them carried it off, and had so led him he knew not where. But for all his thinking, he could not tell what he ought to do, until suddenly he became aware of a glimmer of light in the distance. Without a moment's hesitation, he set out for it, as fast as the unknown and rugged way would permit. Yet again, turning a corner, led by the dim light, he spied something quite new in his experience of the underground regions. A small, irregular shape of something shining. Going up to it, he found it was a piece of mica, called sheep silver in Scotland, and the light flickered as if from a fire behind it. After trying in vain for some time to discover an entrance to the place where it was burning, he came at length to a small chamber in which an opening, high in the wall, revealed a glow beyond. To this opening he managed to scramble up, and then he saw a strange sight. Below sat a little group of goblins around a fire, the smoke of which vanished in the darkness far aloft. The sides of the cave were full of shining minerals like those of the palace hall, and the company was evidently of a superior order. For every one were stones on their head, or arms, or waist, shining dull, gorgeous colors in the light of the fire.